Why is he turning blue? Someone screamed as the swelling tightened around his throat. Before the panic. Before the shouting. Before anyone noticed the color draining from his face. Rowan Halvorson's swelling had already been growing for weeks. At first, it was just a small puff beneath his jaw, then a tightness when he cried, then a stiffness when he slept. The doctors called it minor inflammation. The reports were stamped non-urgent, and the house learned how to ignore it. The Halvorson home in Lake Bluff, Illinois was large, quiet, and perfectly ordered, the kind of place where problems were handled discreetly and never spoken of twice. Cedric Halvorson ran his world with schedules, specialists, and private jets between Lake Bluff and Chicago. Everything had a system. Everything had a report. Everything. Except his son's pain. The only one who watched Rowan closely was Laverne Whitlow, the quiet woman who cleaned the floors, folded the laundry, and carried the baby when his neck grew too stiff to turn. She noticed how he cried differently now, how he pulled at his shirt, how he avoided laying flat, and every time she mentioned it, she was told the same thing. The doctors have already cleared him. Miles away in a small apartment in Madison, Wisconsin, Isadora Halvorson sat nightly beside her phone, waiting for supervised video calls that never lasted long enough. From a distance, she saw the swelling too. From a distance, she felt something was wrong. From a distance, she could do nothing. Legally silenced, medically powerless, still a mother. Sometimes, after the calls ended, she would sit in silence and whisper, "God, I can't reach my child. But you can." Back in Lake Bluff, Laverne felt that same uneasy warning settle in her spirit day after day. A quiet weight, a soft urgency, a sense that time was being lost. She didn't know when the danger would show itself, only that it would. And when it finally did, it would happen on the floor. Without warning, while no one important was watching. What happened in that hallway would force everyone to choose between protocol and a child's life. Before we continue, please like, share, and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's dive back into the story. The hallway was quiet, bathed in the cold hush of late afternoon. Laverne Whitlow was on the floor, knees aching beneath her as she wiped slowly at a smudge that wouldn't lift. Her yellow cleaning gloves were still on. She hadn't taken a break in hours. The cloth moved in half circles under her palm. Mechanical. Tired. Beside her, Rowan Halvorson sat cross-legged on the polished wood, tears streaming down his flushed cheeks. His small body trembled as sobs racked him, his breath stuttering in between. One hand clutched the side of his neck, swollen, taut, angry-looking. The other gripped the front of his shirt like it might somehow pull the pain out of him. Laverne noticed the crying first, the way it turned high and breathless. But when she turned her head and saw his face properly, she froze. Her cleaning cloth dropped. Her eyes widened. It wasn't just that he was in pain. It was the swelling. It looked worse, fuller, tighter. A silent alarm began to ring inside her. "Rowan," she said softly, her voice trembling. She reached out instinctively, not even thinking to remove her glove. Her hand landed gently on his small shoulder, trying to calm him, to steady him. But Rowan didn't calm. He shuddered again, hiccuping through his sobs, his tiny fingers still curled around his shirt. Laverne's eyes scanned the hallway. Empty. No one was coming. The house felt too still, too far away. It was just the two of them, no footsteps, no voices. Just the sound of a little boy crying, and the growing dread rising in Laverne's chest. This wasn't nothing. This wasn't normal. This couldn't wait. In that quiet hallway, something unseen pressed close as if the room itself was listening. The house manager appeared suddenly, summoned by the echo of Rowan's cries. She approached briskly, expression pinched. "What now?" she said, giving Rowan a cursory glance. "It's the same old issue. He does this when he's tired." Laverne opened her mouth, but the woman raised a hand. "Don't alarm the staff. We're already behind. Keep to your tasks. He'll settle." And just like that, the moment passed. Medical help was postponed. Again, later that evening, the house allowed the usual supervised video call. Rowan's mother, Isadora, appeared on the screen, a woman framed by legal silences and carefully monitored emotions. She smiled as the camera came on, her eyes searching. Rowan touched his neck repeatedly, shifting in discomfort. Isadora's voice lifted, strained with concern. "Wait, can I see him a little closer?" The screen tilted, angled away. A hand covered part of the camera. Then the call ended, abruptly, without explanation, and in the house, the silence returned. But Laverne couldn't shake what she'd seen. That night, as the house went still and the lights dimmed, she crept past Rowan's room. Something made her pause. She listened. A soft, pitiful cry came through the door. Then again. She leaned closer. It wasn't just crying. It was a pattern. Every time his head tilted back, Rowan whimpered, fussed, refused to lie flat. He couldn't. It hurt too much. And suddenly, Laverne knew the shift had already happened. Some moments pass quietly, but they change everything. If you've ever wished someone had truly noticed when it still mattered, staying with this story is already an act of remembering. Late that night, Laverne notices that Rowan now refuses to lie flat at all. He cries the moment his head tilts back. The ride to the imaging center was quiet. Rowan's head lay against the side of his car seat, tilted forward at an awkward angle. It was the only position that didn't make him cry. Laverne sat in the back beside him, her eyes flicking constantly to his neck. The swelling looked tighter today, more pronounced. She said nothing. Cedric, seated in the front, had already dismissed her concern once this morning. "This will settle things," he said flatly. "They'll confirm it's just inflammation." The pediatric imaging center in Highland Park was sleek and sterile. Like most medical buildings, soft music, quiet hallways, digital screens that told you how long your wait would be. But the scan was rushed, brief. The technician was pleasant but distant, asking no real questions. Rowan whimpered under the machine's soft hum, flinching each time his head had to be moved. Cedric checked his phone the entire time. Afterward, they waited 20 minutes in a beige room while the report was finalized. "Minor soft tissue inflammation," the doctor said, not even sitting. "Very common in children his age. Should resolve on its own." Cedric exhaled audibly, a smile already forming. "See? Nothing serious." But Laverne didn't exhale. She hadn't even inhaled. The scan hadn't gone deep enough, she knew it. It had only brushed the surface, and the fear in her stomach curled tighter. On the way back, Cedric dropped them at the house and returned to Chicago. "Meetings," he said. Meetings couldn't wait. That night, Rowan wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink. He cried when his head tilted back, not the loud, desperate cries from before, but something thinner, more exhausted. A kind of whimper that lingered long after the sound stopped. Laverne tried everything: warm soup, cold juice, his favorite crackers. He turned his head weakly each time, eyelids fluttering. She sat beside his small bed, praying silently, watching the rise and fall of his chest. Answers were written in ink, but truth was written in fear. The house was still. Medical help had been given, they said. The file had been updated. Everyone had done what was expected. But inside the boys' room, the truth refused to hide. At 10:47 p.m., Rowan shifted uncomfortably, trying to lie flat. The moment his head tilted back, he cried out. Laverne lifted him slightly, and he settled again, his eyes never fully closed. At 1:03 a.m., he pushed her hand away when she tried to adjust his pillow. At 1:55 a.m., he whimpered in his sleep, a tiny sound like a trapped breath. At 2:11 a.m., the sound stopped altogether. Just silence. No movement, no sound, no cry. And somehow, that quiet shattered Laverne's heart more than any scream ever could. She leaned in, breath caught in her throat, her hand hovering over his chest. Was he breathing? Was he? She didn't want to finish the question. She reached for the nightlight, turning it higher. And then, very slowly, Rowan exhaled. Barely. But it was enough. Still, the silence stayed thick in the room. Too thick, too wrong. Some kinds of quiet don't bring peace, they bring warnings. If this part of the story has you holding your breath, Maybe it's because you felt it before, the moment something invisible insists. This isn't over. At 2:11 a.m., Rowan suddenly stops crying, and the silence terrifies Laverne more than the sound ever did. It was still dark when Laverne woke with a jolt. Something had pulled her from sleep, a sound, or maybe the absence of one. She rose quickly from the narrow cot just outside Rowan's room and pushed the door open with trembling fingers. What she saw made her blood run cold. Rowan lay in the crib, his tiny body turned slightly to the side. But he wasn't asleep. His chest lifted in uneven, shallow bursts, breath catching, skipping, then starting again. His mouth was slightly open, as if trying to pull in more air. The swelling on his neck looked worse. Tight, red, angry. It no longer sat passively under the skin, it pushed against it. Visible, threatening. Laverne rushed to the crib. "Baby, breathe. Come on." "Breathe," he whimpered weakly in response, eyelids fluttering. She didn't wait. She ran to the hallway phone and dialed. "Emergency services." "What is your emergency?" "It's a child," Laverne said quickly. "He's breathing irregularly. He has visible swelling around his neck. It's worsening, please. He needs help." The dispatcher asked a series of questions. Laverne answered them all, urgently, heart-pounding. Then came the pause. "We're registering this as non-critical," the voice said. "You can expect paramedics within the hour." "No, he can't wait that long," Laverne cried. "Please." But the line was already moving to the next script. By the time Cedric was contacted, he gave his input without hesitation. "Let them assess," he said. "Observation only. No need to escalate unless absolutely necessary." Laverne could barely speak. She hung up, trembling, the cordless phone heavy in her hand. Minutes ticked by. The room felt smaller by the second. On the wall nearby, the baby monitor blinked. A reminder. Even in emergency, someone was always watching, just never the right ones. Down the hallway, the house phone rang again. Isadora. She'd been calling all morning, requesting updates, demanding access. But the answer was the same each time. "Your legal access is restricted. We cannot authorize visual communication outside of scheduled calls." Isadora's voice cracked. Then the line went dead. Back in Rowan's room, the boy whimpered again. Laverne lowered herself to the floor beside the crib and bowed her head. She didn't care who saw. She didn't care who judged. When fear finally spoke out loud, it sounded like prayer. Her words came out low and hoarse. "God, don't let him slip away while we wait. Please don't let this baby die because no one believed what they saw." Moments later, flashing lights painted the windows red and blue. The paramedics arrived calm, professional. They examined Rowan, took notes, checked vitals. The senior medic leaned toward Laverne quietly, out of earshot from the house staff. "This swelling doesn't behave like something harmless," he said in a low voice. "I'd keep pushing if I were you." Laverne nodded, her throat tight. And suddenly, the world shifted again, not with screams, but with a sentence whispered in warning. If you're still reading, maybe you've known what it's like to be dismissed, delayed, told to wait while something precious fades. Maybe this story feels too close, and maybe that's why you can't look away. The walls were pale, the kind meant to soothe. But nothing soothed Laverne as she sat in the corner of the hospital room, eyes fixed on the child asleep in the crib. Rowan had finally been admitted, though not by Cedric's orders. A senior nurse had stepped in. The nurse had watched him breathe, watched his chest rise unevenly, watched his neck pulse as if fighting against some invisible force. Then she had done something no one else had. She escalated. A deeper scan was ordered within the hour. Laverne wasn't in the room when the machine hummed to life again, but she waited outside the imaging lab, her hands clenched in her lap, silently praying the scan would see what everyone else kept overlooking. The results came back by noon. Internal compression, near the airway. Serious. Dr. Mercer, calm, seasoned, and not easily alarmed, was the first physician to look at the scan without brushing it off. He furrowed his brow. This didn't just appear overnight. He pulled Rowan's file. Pages clicked on the screen. Laverne leaned in, her stomach tightening. Then Mercer paused. Several scans were missing. I requested the full file, he muttered. He tried again. Still incomplete. Where are the earlier imaging records? No one answered. But Laverne already knew. She pulled out her phone, hands shaking slightly. She scrolled weeks back to the early days of the swelling, back when she'd taken photos out of quiet concern. She showed them to Dr. Mercer. The pattern was there. Small, but unmistakable. The swelling had been pressing inward, not just outward. From the very beginning, he nodded slowly. You saw this weeks ago? I did, she whispered. That evening, Isadora found another way to reach them. A courier arrived, discreet, unmarked. Inside the envelope was a notarized record, a formal medical request, signed and dated, filed months ago. Isadora had flagged the swelling in its earliest stage. She had pleaded for further scans. She had cited her own family history. The request had never been followed through. Twice, the document showed escalation was blocked. Laverne's hands trembled as she read it. She looked toward Rowan's crib. Truth did not arrive with thunder. It arrived with quiet evidence. A surgeon entered the room just after midnight. He spoke calmly, directly. I've reviewed the latest scans. The compression is worsening. Another delay could be fatal. Laverne closed her eyes. For a moment, the room spun. It was all there, the warnings, the images, the proof. Someone had made a choice not to listen. And Rowan had kept suffering. She stood quietly and placed her hand on the crib rail. Some truths only survive because one person refuses to stay silent. If you've ever held on to something that mattered when it was easier to let go, staying with this story is already a form of courage. In the quiet that followed, a soft beep from the monitor reminded them all. Time was not on their side. The email came at 4:13 p.m. Not a call, not a live update, just a brief, delayed message buried beneath legal disclaimers and clinical jargon. Isadora opened it with trembling fingers. It had been hours since she'd heard anything. Hours she'd spent pacing the narrow length of her apartment, checking her phone every few minutes, praying that silence didn't mean the worst. Now, as she read, the words seemed to blur. Respiratory episode. Shallow breathing. Near intubation. Observation pending. She didn't make it to the chair. She dropped to the floor, knees buckling under her. Her palm smacked the hardwood, but the pain didn't register. Her other hand covered her mouth, trying to hold back the sound that escaped anyway, something between a sob and a wail. Rowan had almost needed help to breathe, and she hadn't known. She wasn't there. She wasn't allowed to be there. And now he was in a hospital bed, his airway nearly closed, because someone else kept saying, wait. She crawled toward the coffee table, tears soaking her sleeves, and reached for the small matchbox she kept tucked behind a photo frame. Her fingers fumbled, then struck a flame. She lit a single white candle and cupped her hands around it. And for the first time in months, she prayed aloud. Please, I'm still his mother. I know I wasn't perfect. I know I didn't fight the right way at first. But please, don't let my silence then cost him now. Her hands shook. Her voice cracked, but the words didn't stop. In the dim apartment, nothing changed, but something in the air felt closer, charged. Listening, she rose with effort and crossed the room to her desk, where a document sat already half-filled. A legal petition. She'd been working on it since morning. Now she finished the last lines, typed in her trembling signature, and clicked send. A plea for emergency medical authority, a chance slim as it was to make decisions for her own son again. She knew the odds, knew how many doors had already closed, but if she didn't try, if she stayed silent now, two women whispered the same prayer across state lines, and heaven heard both. At that very hour, in a quiet hospital room in Illinois, Laverne sat beside Rowan, her hand resting near his tiny fingers. Her other hand held a crumpled tissue, soaked through. She didn't know why, but she whispered too. Please, help him breathe. Both women, separated by miles, by systems, by time, said the same thing in different words, not for themselves, for him, and somewhere, in the cold halls of bureaucracy, Isadora's petition moved from one inbox to another, forwarded, filtered, delayed, then finally, Opened. And at 6:26 p.m., the reply came, stamped, bold, denied. Some hearts break quietly in sealed rooms and unread files, but some of us keep watching because something inside won't let us walk away. And maybe that's why you're still here. Because somewhere, you felt this helpless love, too. Laverne stood outside the nurse's station, her fingers wrapped tightly around her phone. For days, she had watched decisions get delayed, buried in red tape, silenced under protocol. Tonight, she decided, enough. She approached the charge nurse not timidly, not as staff, but as someone who had seen a child slowly fade in plain sight. "I need you to look at these," she said, voice steady. The nurse blinked. "Miss Whitlow." "We've already." "Please," Laverne interrupted. "Just look." She turned her screen toward the woman. One by one, the images told a story no report had fully captured. Photos from weeks ago. Slight swelling. Then more. More. Angrier. Tighter. Pressing inward. A slow progression that screamed in silence. The nurse's expression shifted, confusion turning to concern. Then something harder. Fear. "Wait here," she said, and disappeared into the surgical wing. Minutes later, Laverne handed the same archive, printed, labeled, sequenced directly to the attending surgeon. She didn't ask permission. She didn't check with Cedric. She just acted. The surgeon flipped through the photos, eyes narrowing. "Why hasn't this been escalated before now?" Laverne said nothing. She didn't need to explain what silence looked like. An emergency surgical team was called. A time was set. Rowan would be taken into the OR within the hour. Cedric arrived mid-scrub. He stormed into the hallway, half-gowned, confusion written across his face. "What's going on? Why wasn't I contacted?" A nurse responded without hesitation. "Your consent wasn't required. The attending approved it under emergency protocol." Cedric turned to Laverne, fury barely contained. "You went around me." She didn't flinch. "I did, because someone had to." Inside the OR, the team worked with precision. Scalpel, suction, clamp, cut, and then the truth revealed itself. The obstruction was real, dense, pressed dangerously against the airway. It hadn't developed overnight. It had been there, growing. When fear demanded obedience, faith chose defiance. In the surgical observation window, Laverne stood alone, her gloved hand pressed to the glass, her eyes fixed on the small, still body on the table below. She didn't feel victorious. She felt afraid. But beneath that fear was something deeper, a knowing. She had done the right thing. Later, as the surgeon emerged from the OR, his face was calm, but firm. "It went well. We relieved the pressure, cleared the obstruction. He's stable now." Laverne nodded, emotion too thick to speak. The surgeon hesitated before adding, quieter. "If he hadn't been brought in tonight, he wouldn't have survived the week." Laverne closed her eyes. There it was, the sentence she had feared most, and somehow, the one that made her feel less alone. Sometimes a story turns not on the loudest moment, but the one someone risks everything to make happen. If you've ever stepped forward when you were told to stay still, maybe this story is already yours, too. The walls of the pediatric ICU hummed with a stillness that felt almost sacred. Machines blinked steadily. Monitors beeped in quiet rhythm. And in the center of it all lay Rowan Halvorson, his chest rising and falling, each breath deeper than the last. For the first time in weeks, he was breathing freely. The surgery had lasted just under 3 hours. The team worked with urgent precision, guided by the images Laverne had collected and the notes the surgeon had rewritten in haste. They moved like a unit forged under pressure, not just to fix, but to save. Outside the surgical wing, Cedric Halvorson sat alone. No phone calls, no orders to give, no legal shields to hide behind. Just silence. He hadn't spoken since the surgeon told him the truth. That the obstruction had been growing for weeks. That his son had almost suffocated while everyone argued over paperwork. For a man used to control, it was a kind of unraveling. 2 floors above, in a private room with limited access, Isadora sat in front of a screen. The video feed showed only a hallway, not the operating room. Not Rowan, but she refused to look away. It was all she had. She watched the feet of passing nurses, counted scrubs, matched every beep in the distance to her own rising hope. When her eyes began to blur with exhaustion, she whispered, "Don't leave him alone." And somehow, she knew he wasn't, because downstairs Laverne had never once left his side. She sat by the recovery bed, eyes wide open, lips moving non-stop, a quiet stream of prayer flowing through the sterile air. She prayed through the beeping. She prayed through the waiting. She prayed like someone who had nothing left but prayer. This was not timing. This was not chance. This was mercy finding a doorway. And when Rowan opened his eyes, not fully, just enough she felt it before she saw it. His chest lifted slowly. No rattle, no gasp, just air. Laverne placed her hand gently on his, and he didn't flinch. For the first time, his little body wasn't curled in pain. He was still, at peace. The surgeon returned an hour later, removing his mask as he entered. "It was close," he said quietly. "But we got to him in time." Cedric said nothing. He only nodded once, stiffly. Isadora wasn't told directly. She only saw the shift, the nurse walking more calmly, the doctor pausing at the door instead of rushing past. She leaned forward, hands pressed to the screen. "Thank you," she whispered. Even if no one heard her. In the room, Laverne didn't speak either. She just kept her hand there, steady, warm, unmoving. The miracle had come, not loudly, not with flashes of light or trumpets, but through a series of small, desperate, human choices. If you're still here, maybe you've known that kind of miracle, the one that came not all at once, but breath by breath, after you thought it might never arrive. Maybe you've been the hand that stayed, or the voice that wouldn't stop praying. Either way, this part of the story belongs to you, too. The room was quiet, filled with the hum of low monitors and soft footsteps outside the glass doors. Sunlight filtered through the blinds in thin golden stripes, landing on the edge of the recovery crib where Rowan now slept. For the first time in months, Isadora stood beside him, not on a screen, not through a chaperoned call, but in person. The medical board had approved supervised access, no more, no less. She had no rights to discharge, no path to bring him home. But she was here, legally, physically, and Rowan was real beneath her fingers. She reached down slowly, afraid to wake him, brushing a loose strand of hair off his forehead. His cheeks were warmer than she remembered. He stirred faintly at her touch but didn't cry. He breathed softly. No obstruction, no pain. Isadora closed her eyes, just for a moment, and let the quiet surround her. This was not the reunion she had once dreamed of, but it was real. Across the room, Cedric stood against the far wall. He hadn't said much. He hadn't needed to. But just before the nurse returned with paperwork, he stepped forward, voice low. "I've added you to all medical authorizations," he said. "No more exclusions." Isadora looked up, stunned. "I can't undo what I've done," Cedric added. "But I can stop doing it." Saying, he left the room before she could reply. That same afternoon, a hospital official approached Laverne with an envelope. Inside was formal confirmation. Protected caregiver status. Permanent. A designation that came with legal standing, hospital clearance, and a note of personal commendation from the attending surgeon. She folded the paper neatly and tucked it into her pocket. She hadn't fought for recognition. But it came. Rowan's swelling faded gradually. Not overnight. Not like a miracle tied up in ribbon, but slowly each day showing a little more color. A little less tension. The team remained cautious. There were still check-ins, still risks, but breath came easier. His eyes stayed open longer. He smiled, once, in his sleep. The family remained divided. No court order reversed. No dramatic reunions scripted in a hallway. But something had shifted. They were no longer erased from each other's lives, just reshaped inside them. God did not return everything at once, but he returned enough to let hope stay alive. Outside, the day moved on. Inside, time felt slower, more sacred. Laverne stood near the door, letting Isadora have these few final moments uninterrupted. She watched as the mother whispered something to the child, forehead resting lightly near his hand, and she knew some stories don't end with everything restored. But love had stayed, through silence, through systems, through suffocating delay. Some endings do not reunite everything that was broken, they simply prove that love was never the wrong choice. If quiet hope still matters to you, staying with stories like this is already a form of faith.